The Colosseum is not an eternal stone. It is like a book whose last pages have been erased and whose ending has been forgotten. I stood at the foot of the amphitheater, and the wind whipped dust into my face, as if the ancient stone itself whispered to me, not for legends of gladiators and blood, but for how one empty strip of stone can tell an entire era, and how people's attitudes toward the heritage of antiquity changed. With a history that does not beg for a headline. Let me say right away, the Colosseum is not whole, but only partly a monument. Century after century it lost its outer shell, and if you look closely, you can see how, on one side, the final layer seems to have been left unfinished, as if someone removed the lid from a pocket watch, and in reality something quite different happened. The stone of the Colosseum was not broken out of joy, it was simply laid bare for other uses. Palaces, churches, bridges were built. Millions of bricks and slabs sometimes disappeared not for luxury, but for the city's needs, which, in place of antiquity, wanted to go on living. And this is why that vacancy on the facade matters. It has become a physical timestamp that tells us how attitudes toward the past changed. I came to Rome not so much for legends about gladiators, but to understand how one half became a full symbol that we read as the history of the city's soul. We say in the morning that the Colosseum is the greatest amphitheater of antiquity, but by noon it begins to hint. Remember, I am not just a museum. I am proof that even... And this thought does not let me sleep peacefully. For if half disappeared, how many more stories do we not see behind the walls, hidden behind the dust of time? They say that romantic adoration of antiquity often blinds us to reality. And the reality of the Colosseum is this. The outer layer, made of bright and smooth travertine stone, was over time removed and used in the construction and repairs of the city. In the Middle Ages, the inhabitants took the stone to raise the walls of their palaces, to build basilicas, to fortify defenses against weather and raids. There was no malice, there was no crime against memory. There was a common choice for the times: to survive, to act, to build a new city on the ruins of the old. Gradually, the face of the amphitheater became different, and we found ourselves facing the fact that history is not always written on lush marble paper. Sometimes it is written on a dusty brick plane, and on the hand of the one who lifts the last curtain from the old facade. Where is that half, you may ask? What exactly disappeared, and why is it so important to understand this disappearance? Even into the last centuries, people saw the Colosseum as an almost perfect structure, surrounded outside by colonnades and arches, carved and ceremonial. But after many years of operation as a quarry, most of the outer layers were removed and recycled. The inner framework, arches, the rhythms of the massive suspended galleries, all this remained inside, but outside there was no longer what had once been considered the face of the city. This rift between the amphitheater's inner world and what we see today became our stage. Here we confront how the city experiences its past and turns it into a monument through memory, not through the smooth surface of painted stone. Chapter 2: Earthquakes, Fires, and the Thieving Hands of Stone. The history of the Colosseum's destruction is not reducible to a single cause. It is made up of many moments. The facades and cladding bore the blows of time. Earthquakes occurred that seemed to push the protruding sections toward collapse. In the chronicles, we hear of upheavals that shook Rome within the span of its 1,000-year fate. And these upheavals came more often than we tend to think. They deprived the amphitheater not only of beauty, but also of the integrity of its structure. And after earthquakes, the city often resorted to dismantling, to restore roads, towers, and houses. And each such dismantling left its imprint on the Colosseum's appearance. But it wasn't only nature that left its mark. People living in the city sometimes believed that the Colosseum was no longer needed as a temple for spectacles and could serve the needs of everyday life. And then the stone went into other hands. Palaces, churches, fortifications, all of this became part of a new city line, and the Colosseum was transformed into building material. From that moment, the building began a new role. Not only a place for performances and a monument of antiquity, but a source of materials for the line. This is not an act of vandalism, but a reflection of how society repurposes memory and turns it into accessible resources. I spoke with archivists, restorers, and historians who explained to me one thing without which it is difficult to understand the full drama of the Colosseum's history. In the years when the city needed stone and brick for new projects, at that moment the Colosseum became the very imprint of time that we see today. It did not vanish without a trace. It hides traces in the layers we try to read when we close our eyes and listen to the echo that tells us of the past. Chapter 3: Archives, Diaries, and Unexpected Discoveries. The task of my investigation was simple and at the same time difficult: to find a story that would explain not only why half is missing and why this matters, but also how exactly people perceived the monument of antiquity. I met in Rome an elderly archivist, a man who carried with him a slim notebook filled with small handwriting, and who seemed to believe that in every stroke of the letters lay pages of an entire era. He spoke of documents, drawings by old masters, and letters that once passed between cardinals and architects. These were not merely plans, they were fissures in the relationship between past and present, between the desire to preserve and the necessity to go on living. One night, when the autumn wind blew through the city, he showed me a tiny folder hidden in an old chest under the attic of the archive building. Within it lay copies of notes made by one of the architects who had once designed the exterior of the Colosseum. These notes were not drawings in the literal sense. They were notes about which stones should be removed, which spaces protected, where to place new doors for city needs. The man in question, from the diaries, arise questions that are hard to answer simply. What is the role of history in a city where every brick knows its price? What responsibility does modern society bear for the memory of antiquity? These questions became for me not merely boundaries, but true signs urging me to go further, not to stop at what is already known. In the archival records, names of people often flashed: a museum guard, a young restorer, because it is history found in the small strokes of diaries and notes that turns dry facts into living drama. A drama about how humanity tends to its memory, how we choose which pages of memory deserve to be restored and which to forget. Chapter 4: Modernity and the Responsibility to the Future. Don't think that the history of the Colosseum ends somewhere in a museum or in textbooks. It lives here and now, in a city that decides every day what its appearance will be. I saw modern architects and restorers argue not about how to make the colonnaded arches beautiful, but about how to preserve their authenticity, without weighing down the city's appearance with the heavy baggage of the past that could simply be discarded. And here comes one of the main dramas of our story. Memory is not something that can be kept in a box and forgotten in silence. Memory must be alive. It requires attention, dialogue, and the courage to speak of past pain. I met people who believe that the Colosseum has not only a half, but a whole heart, something that never disappeared, even when the stone changed its shape. This heart is in the relationship of people to the monument. In museums and on the streets of Rome, the memory of the makers, builders, and spectators is passed. And here is the finale. which is not an end, but rather a promise. We are still seeking an answer to the question of why that half disappeared precisely. We have found many reasons and many viewpoints: historical, cultural, ethical. But most importantly, we have realized that the disappearance of a part of the outer facade became a mirror of the city's fate. Rome, like any living organism, eternally peering into the mirror of its past, yet at the same time tending toward the future. Strategies for preserving memory, responsible recycling of materials, and respect for the heritage. That is the lesson the Colosseum gave us without words, but with every layer of dust and every cracked stone. Epilogue: A return to the present. If you are walking today along the same road I recently walked, you will notice not just ruins and tourists. You will see traces of eras that until today have not lived on film, but in the breath of the city. The Colosseum remembers everything, both how its appearance has changed and how people's attitude toward memory has changed. It teaches us to find the balance between honoring the past and the need to move forward. And if you ask me why this story is needed, I would say this: because memory without movement becomes dry, and movement without memory is blind. We must move forward, preserving what makes us human. And yes, if you still wonder why the Colosseum is missing a half, the answer is simple: because this is half of the city, half of time, and a whole story about how society chooses to live with its memory. This is not just a building. This is a living dialogue between who we were, who we are becoming, and who we want our children and our children's children to be. Because the Colosseum is not a statue on a square, it is the city's mirror in which our fears, our decisions, and our hope for the future are reflected. To be continued in the next parts, we will delve into specific archival materials, tell the stories of restorers who argue with modern preservation methods, and show how small decisions today become big lessons for the future.